Let's use the catalog module as an example. It is the largest module in Magento, so please relax. Most modules don't contain half as many files and directories. So we can find the catalog module in vendor Magento and then module catalog right here. But before we look at the directories in this module, I want to talk a bit about module names. A module always has a namespace or vendor and a module name. If a module is installed in app code, the namespace and the module names correspond to folders in the file system. But if a module is installed with Composer, we can't see the namespace and the module name that easily. We have to look it up somewhere else. We can always see a module's namespace and module name in the registration PHP file in this identifier. We'll talk more about the registration PHP file, what it is for and how it works later on. For now, please just look here. In front of the underscore, we can see the namespace, and behind the underscore, we can see the module's name. Please note, both start with a capital character. That's required. For most core modules that are distributed with Magento, the vendor namespace is Magento. Third-party developers usually choose their company or their personal name. The purpose of vendor namespaces is to avoid clashes between modules, which is kind of the purpose of any namespace, I guess. As a rule of thumb, if a directory contains PHP classes, it is written with a capital first character. For example, block or console. This is because of the PSR4 autoloading standard that maps PHP namespaces and classes to directories and files. If a directory contains other things, it's in lowercase, for example, etc, internationalization, or view. So let's have a look at all these directories. First, API. This directory contains PHP interfaces for business logic use cases that are covered by this module. Then there's also API data, which contains the interfaces for the data transfer objects that are used with the API interfaces. Both together are also called a module's service contracts. Then there's blocks, which is a view layer logic, console for command line interface commands executed via bin Magento. Controllers are for request processing logic. Cron contains code for tasks that are executed via cron. Customer data contains classes that make server-side session data available to the storefront JavaScript. etc contains configuration, almost exclusively as XML. Some of these files are located directly within the etc directory, and if so, they are applicable globally. But there are also subdirectories that correspond to areas within Magento. So if a configuration file is in etc frontend, for example, it only applies to storefront HTTP requests. Then there's the helper directory. That's kind of a legacy namespace. It's a kitchen sink, could also be called util or system or something. It doesn't really have any semantic meaning, so it should be avoided in new modules. Then there's the internationalization folder, which contains the source CSV files, translations basically. The model directory contains ORM entities and implementations of the API interfaces. Observers, that's for event observers, and plugins contains the classes for Magento 2's extension mechanism. Pricing is an example for module-specific class hierarchies. So if your module needs some classes and they don't really fit into any of the other more conventional folders, don't be afraid to create your own class hierarchy directly within your module. Setup contains migrations for managing database tables and content. Test contains unit and for third-party modules also integration tests. UI contains classes that are mainly used in the admin UI rendering. Now, View contains all templates and view configurations, but also CSS or less classes, JavaScript images, and so on. And if we look inside of View, we can see it's also separated into Magento areas. So admin HTML contains all those things for the admin UI views. View base contains files that are shared between the storefront and the admin UI. And then within an area like front end, we can see there's a directory called layout, which is for page configuration. Templates, which is for server-side rendering templates. They're PHTML files. UI component contains configuration for Magento's own UI component system. And web contains files that are exposed directly to HTTP requests, so images, JavaScript, and more. And in there we also can see another template directory which contains HTML templates which are processed by JavaScript, so for client-side rendering. And then we also have the view model directory, which is the new home for view layer logic. Used to be all blocks, now there's also the view models. So many of these types of classes will be covered in their own videos. This is just intended to give you an overview, what's there, so you've seen it once. Over time, you will become very familiar with this directory structure. Just wait and see.